Marcus had always been particular about mirrors, not vain, never vain, but discerning. The bathroom mirror at home caught the light just right in the morning, softening the lines around his eyes. The one in his office elevator reflected confidence back at him. Broad shoulders, firm handshake energy. The mirror in his car showed him as the man who had everything under control, even in traffic that made other men scream. But today, something had shifted. Today, Marcus found himself in a place that defied explanation. A vast hall lined with mirrors of every conceivable size and shape. Some were tall and narrow, making him appear noble, stretched toward heaven. Others were wide and forgiving, adding bulk to his frame, substance to his presence. There were mirrors framed in gold that made his skin glow with prosperity, and mirrors edged in silver that sharpened his jawline into something almost predatory. He moved from mirror to mirror, and each one whispered a different promise. In the ornate Baroque mirror, he was a Renaissance prince, cultured and refined. The sleek modern mirror showed him as a tech mogul, disrupting industries with a glance. The antique mirror, with its slightly warped surface, transformed him into a mysterious figure from another century, dangerous and compelling. The deeper he ventured into this hall of reflections, the more intoxicating it became. Here was proof, tangible, visual proof, of everything he had always suspected about himself. He was extraordinary. He was chosen. He was the protagonist in a story where everyone else was merely supporting cast. Hours passed, or perhaps days. Time meant nothing here. Marcus had found mirrors that showed him as a lover whose touch could heal broken hearts, as a father whose children would never disappoint him, as a leader whose vision could reshape the world. Each reflection felt more real than his actual life, more true than the mundane existence of alarm clocks and grocery stores and small talk with neighbors. But then, in his peripheral vision, he caught sight of something that made his blood turn cold. In the space between two mirrors, just a sliver of wall, there was the faintest outline of a window. Through it, barely visible, was the world he had left behind, and there, in that world, was another man. A man who looked remarkably like Marcus, but older somehow, more weathered. This man was sitting alone at a kitchen table, surrounded by divorce papers and overdue bills. His children's photos were face down on the counter. His phone showed 17 unread messages from a boss who had stopped believing in his promises. Marcus tried to look away, to return to the comforting lies of his mirror hall, but the window grew larger. More windows appeared between the mirrors, and through each one, he could see the same man, himself, in different moments of reckoning. Here he was explaining to his wife why the promotion hadn't come through again. There he was, alone at a bar, telling a stranger about the novel he was definitely going to finish someday. In another window, he was staring at his bank account, wondering where all the money had gone, wondering when he had become the kind of man who borrowed from friends and called it temporary. The mirrors began to crack. One by one, spiderweb fractures spread across their surfaces. The Renaissance prince crumbled. The tech mogul dissolved. The mysterious figure from another century shattered into 1,000 pieces, each one reflecting not what Marcus wanted to see, but what was actually there. A middle-aged man in an ill-fitting suit, standing in an empty room, talking to himself. As Schopenhauer might whisper from the shadows, what we call desire is merely the will's way of binding us to an illusion, the illusion that fulfillment lies somewhere other than in the acceptance of what is. The last mirror fell, and Marcus stood surrounded by broken glass and broken dreams. But in that devastation, something unexpected happened. For the first time in years, he saw his actual face, not enhanced, not idealized, not filtered through the lens of who he thought he should be, just him, tired, flawed, real. And in that reality, strange as it seemed, there was a kind of relief. The Hall of Mirrors was revealed for what it had always been, an elaborate cage built from his own desperate need to be anyone other than himself. This is what Jung called the inflation of the ego. That moment when we become so enamored with our idealized self-image that we lose touch with our actual humanity. Jung, drawing from decades of clinical observation, recognized that the ego's desperate attempt to maintain its grandiose self-concept often leads to a complete disconnection from reality. In modern life, we see this manifesting everywhere. The middle manager who speaks as if he's a CEO, the amateur photographer who acts like Ansel Adams, the weekend warrior who believes he's one injury away from professional sports. Social media has become our collective hall of mirrors, each carefully curated post reflecting back not who we are, but who we desperately wish to be seen as. In relationships, this shows up as the man who cannot understand why his partner doesn't appreciate his potential, why she focuses on his actions rather than his intentions. Schopenhauer would call this a particularly cruel trick of the will, the way it convinces us that our suffering comes from not being recognized for our true greatness, when in fact our suffering comes from the very act of demanding such recognition. The will creates the ego's hunger for admiration, then ensures that no amount of admiration will ever be enough. The ancients called it hubris, the gods' way of marking those destined for a fall. Today, psychology names it narcissistic inflation, the ego's desperate flight from its own ordinary humanity. What does your hall of mirrors look like? What reflections have you been collecting to avoid seeing your actual face? And more importantly, what would happen if you let them all shatter at once? In the end, every man must choose between the comfort of his illusions and the terrible freedom of being exactly who he is. Most choose the mirrors. They die surrounded by beautiful lies, never having lived a single authentic day. Every morning, Thomas sells pieces of his soul for things he doesn't actually want. The marketplace appeared at dawn, always at dawn, stretching endlessly in both directions along a cobblestone street that seemed to exist nowhere and everywhere at once. Thomas had been coming here for so long that he couldn't remember his first transaction, only that it had seemed so small, so harmless at the time. The stalls were magnificent. Gleaming brass fixtures held treasures that made his heart race. The respect of colleagues displayed in crystalline bottles that caught the light like liquid gold. The approval of his father arranged in neat rows like vintage wine, each bottle promising to finally fill the emptiness that had lived in his chest since childhood. There were shelves lined with the admiration of beautiful women, packaged in silk boxes that whispered his name when he walked past. Status symbols hung from silver chains, each one guaranteed to transform him into the man he knew he was meant to be. But everything here came with a price, and the currency was always the same: pieces of himself. Thomas had learned the exchange rate by heart. His authentic laughter was worth a weekend of feeling important. At dinner parties, where he told other people's jokes and pretended to enjoy conversations that bored him to tears. His genuine curiosity about the world could buy him a month of being seen as successful, though it meant spending 8 hours a day in meetings about meetings, discussing nothing of consequence with people he neither liked nor respected. The merchant who ran his favorite stall was ancient and elegant, with fingers like bird bones and eyes that held the accumulated weight of 10,000 transactions. She never pressured, never haggard. She simply displayed her wares and waited. Thomas knew she had seen men like him before, men who came to the marketplace with full souls and left as hollow as bells, ringing with emptiness, but making beautiful sounds for others to admire. Today's offering was particularly tempting. On the counter lay a promotion, gleaming like a golden apple. It would make him regional director, give him an office with windows, a title that would make his mother proud when she told her friends at Bridge Club. The merchant's price was written in elegant script on a card beside it. His ability to feel genuine excitement about anything ever again. Thomas hesitated. He still had fragments of that capacity left, small moments when a song on the radio could make him feel alive, or when he watched his daughter learn to ride her bicycle and forgot briefly that he was supposed to be advancing his career rather than enjoying his life. But those moments were becoming rarer, and the promotion was right there, solid and real, and approved by everyone whose opinion seemed to matter. As he reached for his wallet, not for money, but for the small velvet pouch where he kept the remaining pieces of his authentic self, he noticed something that made him pause. In the corner of the stall, barely visible behind the gleaming prizes, was a small, dusty shelf. On it sat objects he didn't recognize as merchandise: a child's drawing of a house with too many windows, a love letter never sent, a journal filled with dreams that had seemed too foolish to pursue. "What are those?" he asked the merchant. She followed his gaze and smiled, but it wasn't the practiced smile she used for transactions. This smile was different, almost sad. "Those are returns," she said softly. "Items that previous customers tried to buy back." "Buy back?" "Oh yes," she said, her voice taking on the quality of an old fairy tale. "Occasionally, someone realizes what they've traded away and tries to return their prizes in exchange for their original selves, but it doesn't work that way, you see. Once authenticity is spent, once genuine emotion is traded for artificial satisfaction, the exchange cannot be undone. Those items on the shelf are all that remains of such attempts, fragments, echoes, shadows of what was once real." Thomas looked more closely at the dusty shelf. Among the returned item, he recognized things that looked familiar, eerily familiar, a laugh that sounded like his own from 20 years ago, a sense of wonder he was sure he'd had as a child, the capacity for spontaneous joy that he remembered feeling before he learned to calculate the social value of every emotion. The merchant watched him with knowing eyes. "The promotion is still available," she said gently. "Many men have built impressive lives with much less authenticity than you still possess." Thomas stared at the golden apple of advancement, then at the dusty shelf of irretrievable losses. For the first time in decades, he saw the marketplace for what it truly was, not a place of acquisition, but of systematic self-destruction. Every man here was trading away the very qualities that made life worth living in exchange for things that looked like life but felt like death. He thought of Schopenhauer's insight that what we call ambition is often the will's way of tricking us into destroying ourselves while believing we're improving our condition. The will creates desires that can only be fulfilled by sacrificing the very self that originally wanted fulfillment. Thomas put away his velvet pouch. The merchant nodded, unsurprised. She had seen this moment before, though not often. Most men completed their transactions and left happy, at least temporarily, but occasionally someone saw through to the true price of their desires. As he walked away from the stall, Thomas felt something strange, a hollowness where his ambitions used to live, but also a lightness, as if he had been carrying a weight he didn't know was there. The marketplace began to fade around him. the stalls becoming translucent, the other customers revealing themselves as the ghosts they had always been. When he opened his eyes, he was sitting in his actual office, looking at an actual memo about an actual promotion. The golden apple was still there, still tempting, but now he could see the price tag clearly, written in his own handwriting. Everything that made him who he was, traded for the approval of people whose respect wasn't worth having. This is what Jung identified as the shadow of ambition, the unconscious process by which we systematically trade our authentic selves for socially acceptable facades. Jung observed that modern society creates a marketplace of pseudo-achievements, where individuals exchange their genuine emotions, creativity, and authentic responses for symbols of success that provide no real satisfaction. In today's world, we see this manifesting as the entrepreneur who builds a business around something he hates because it's scalable, the artist who abandons personal vision for market appeal, the parent who sacrifices presence for the ability to provide material advantages. In relationships, it appears as the man who performs success rather than living authentically, who measures his worth by his ability to provide status symbols rather than genuine connection. Schopenhauer would recognize this as the will's most sophisticated trap. It convinces us that our suffering comes from not having enough external validation, when in fact our suffering comes from the very act of trading our inner life for outer approval. The will creates the desire for recognition, then ensures that each achievement only deepens our disconnection from ourselves. The ancients called it selling your soul to the devil. Today, psychology names it the false self, the carefully constructed persona that earns social rewards while slowly suffocating the authentic person beneath. What are you trading pieces of yourself to obtain? What would you discover if you stopped shopping for approval and started listening to the parts of yourself you've been trying to sell? The most successful prisoners are those who have forgotten they ever wanted to be free. They measure their progress by how beautifully they can decorate their cells. David builds walls so high that he forgets there was ever a world beyond them. The blueprints arrived every morning with his coffee, always perfectly drawn, always completely detailed. David had been following them for so long that he no longer questioned their origin or wondered who had designed them. The plans were simply there, as reliable as sunrise, telling him exactly what to think, exactly how to feel, exactly who to be. Today's blueprint called for a particularly impressive structure, a fortress of righteousness with walls thick enough to keep out doubt and towers tall enough to look down upon anyone who might challenge his worldview. The foundation had been laid years ago, built from the stones of his first heartbreak, when Jennifer had left him for someone who understood her better. That phrase had become the cornerstone of everything David built afterward, a defensive architecture designed to ensure that understanding would never again be required of him. The walls rose section by section, each one labeled with meticulous care. Here was the wall of intellectual superiority, constructed from carefully selected facts and figures that proved beyond question that his way of seeing the world was the only logical way. There was the tower of moral authority, built from his strict adherence to principles that happened to align perfectly with his existing preferences and prejudices, and stretching between them the bridge of righteous anger, which allowed him to cross quickly from any uncomfortable question to the familiar ground of indignation. David worked with the focused intensity of a man whose life depended on completing the construction. Each day brought new threats that required new defenses. A co-worker who saw things differently needed a wall to block their perspective. A book that challenged his assumptions required a tower of counter-arguments. A moment of self-doubt demanded immediate reinforcement of his certainty buttresses. The fortress grew magnificent. From within its walls, David could see the world with perfect clarity. Everything made sense from his elevated position. People were either allies or enemies. Ideas were either correct or foolish. Situations were either acceptable or intolerable. The messy ambiguity that had once tormented him was banished completely. His fortress provided something invaluable, the absolute certainty that he was right about everything that mattered. But as Schopenhauer observed, the will often grants our deepest wishes in ways that reveal them to be curses in disguise. Visitors came less frequently now. David told himself this was because most people couldn't appreciate the precision of his construction, the logical perfection of his worldview. From his tower, he could see them in the distance, wandering in the chaos of uncertainty, changing their minds, admitting mistakes, living in the uncomfortable space between questions. How exhausting that must be, he thought. How inefficient. It was only when he tried to leave his fortress for the first time in years that David discovered what he had actually built. The doors, which had seemed so substantial from the inside, were revealed from the outside to be painted on the walls. The windows, which had provided such a clear view of the world, were mirrors, reflecting only his own beliefs back to himself. The towers, which had made him feel so elevated above the common confusion of humanity, were actually deep pits that had gradually isolated him below the level of ordinary human experience. He had not built a fortress at all. He had excavated a grave and convinced himself it was a castle. The blueprints, scattered on the ground around him, revealed themselves to be blank pages. There had never been a master plan, only his desperate need to feel certain in an uncertain world. Every wall, every tower, every defensive structure had been built from his own fear of admitting that he might not know everything, that his perspective might be limited, that his understanding might be incomplete. David stood in his excavated certainty and experienced something he had not felt in decades. The terrifying, exhilarating possibility that he might be wrong about almost everything. The world outside his fortress was vast and strange and full of people whose experiences he had never bothered to understand. They were living in uncertainty, yes, but they were also living in wonder, in growth, in the constant possibility of learning something new. The walls began to crumble, not from any external force, but from the simple recognition of what they truly were. Barriers not against error, but against experience, not against wrong ideas, but against new ideas, not against confusion, but against the kind of confusion that leads to wisdom. For the first time in years, David felt uncertain about something important, whether the person he had become was the person he actually wanted to be. The feeling was uncomfortable, disorienting, and absolutely liberating. This is what Jung recognized as the shadow of intellectual pride, the unconscious process by which we construct elaborate mental fortresses to defend ourselves against the vulnerability of not knowing. Jung observed that the more desperately we cling to our certainties, the more likely we are to be defending against some fundamental uncertainty about ourselves. In contemporary culture, this manifests as the political partisan who cannot acknowledge any validity in opposing viewpoints, the expert who cannot admit the limits of their expertise, the parent who cannot allow their children to make different choices without interpreting it as a personal attack. In relationships, this appears as the man who would rather be right than connected, who builds walls of logic to defend against the messy uncertainty of emotional intimacy. Schopenhauer would see this as the will's way of convincing us that our suffering comes from living in an uncertain world, when in fact our suffering comes from our desperate attempts to escape uncertainty. The will creates the desire for absolute knowledge, then ensures that each certainty we acquire only deepens our isolation from the uncertain but vibrant world of genuine experience. The ancients called it the sin of pride, the refusal to accept our human limitations. Today, psychology names it defensive intellectualization, the use of mental constructs to avoid emotional reality. What fortress have you built to protect yourself from being wrong? What would you discover about the world and about yourself if you allowed your certainties to crumble just enough to let in some light? The wisest prisoners are those who realize their cells are made of their own thoughts, and that the keys have been in their pockets all along. But wisdom, like freedom, requires the courage to be uncertain about everything you once thought you knew. Every night, Robert arranges his pain like precious artifacts, polishing each grievance until it gleams. The museum appeared when ordinary people were sleeping, materiating in the space between midnight and dawn in what had once been Robert's spare bedroom. Its halls were lined with carefully illuminated displays, each one containing a perfectly preserved moment of injustice, betrayal, or disappointment from his 38 years of life. Robert moved through his collection with the practiced efficiency of a master curator. Here, in the Hall of Professional Slights, was the meeting where Johnson had taken credit for his idea, displayed under museum-quality lighting with a detailed placard explaining the exact nature of the theft and its lasting impact on his career trajectory. There, in the gallery of romantic betrayals, was the evening Sarah had chosen to end their engagement, her words preserved in amber like prehistoric insects, every inflection maintained for future study. The crown jewel of his collection occupied the entire East Wing, the comprehensive archive of parental failures. This exhibition traced 40 years of documentation, from his mother's failure to attend his 7th grade science fair to his father's inability to express pride in any of his achievements. Each display was meticulously cataloged, cross-referenced, and analyzed for its contribution to his current psychological landscape. Robert took particular pride in this museum. Unlike the chaos of actual life, where pain came and went unpredictably, here everything was organized, permanent, accessible for study. He had spent years perfecting the preservation techniques, learning to keep each wound fresh and vivid, never allowing time to dull the edges or blur the details. This was his life's work, his masterpiece, a complete record of every way the world had failed to treat him as he deserved. Visitors were rare, but when they came, they were invariably impressed by the scope of the collection. Some tried to point out that everyone had similar experiences, that disappointment was universal. But Robert could demonstrate with documentary evidence that his sufferings were uniquely comprehensive, particularly unfair, especially damaging. The museum proved it, case by case, exhibit by exhibit. Tonight, as he made his usual rounds, Robert noticed something troubling. In the corner of the Hall of Professional Slights, barely visible behind the Johnson incident, was a small, unlit display case. Inside was a memory he had almost forgotten, the day he had been promoted to team lead, when his colleagues had thrown him a surprise celebration. Strange that he had archived this moment with all the others, but given it no lighting, no prominence, no interpretive materials. Curious, he moved deeper into the museum, looking more carefully. Between the illuminated grievances, He began to notice other dim displays. The evening Sarah had said she loved his laugh before the engagement ended. The letter his mother had written when he graduated college before their relationship soured. The handshake of respect from his father after his first published article before expectations grew too heavy to bear. These moments existed in his collection, but he had stored them in darkness, relegated them to the spaces between his featured exhibitions. Why? They were part of the same experiences, the same relationships, the same life. But somehow, in his curation process, he had chosen to highlight only certain aspects of each story. As Schopenhauer might observe, we curate our memories not to preserve truth, but to maintain our preferred relationship with suffering. Robert found a switch he had never noticed before, hidden behind the main control panel. When he flipped it, lights came on throughout the museum, illuminating thousands of displays he had somehow failed to see. Here was the colleague who had recommended him for the promotion. There was Sarah teaching him to dance at her sister's wedding. In the East Wing, his parents at his college graduation, exhausted from the 6-hour drive, but glowing with pride. The museum transformed. What had seemed like a comprehensive archive of victimization was revealed to be a highly selective editing of a much more complex story. For every betrayal he had preserved, there was a kindness he had hidden in shadow. For every disappointment he had illuminated, there was a moment of connection he had stored in darkness. But the most disturbing discovery was yet to come. As the full lights revealed the true scope of his collection, Robert realized that he had been coming to this museum not just to remember his pain, but to cultivate it. Each nightly visit had been an act of maintenance, keeping wounds fresh that wanted to heal, polishing grievances that wanted to fade, ensuring that his identity as someone who had been uniquely wronged by life remained intact. He had built this museum not to honor his experiences, but to trap himself within the most painful version of his own story. The revelation was devastating and liberating in equal measure. Standing in the fully illuminated space, Robert could see that he had been living not his actual life, but a carefully curated exhibition designed to prove that he deserved to remain bitter, disappointed, and alone. Every relationship, every opportunity, every moment of potential joy had been filtered through the lens of his collection, measured not for its inherent value, but for its contribution to his archive of grievances. The museum began to fade as dawn approached, but before it disappeared completely, Robert made a decision that would change everything. He began dismantling the displays, not to destroy the memories, but to stop treating them as sacred relics of his victimization. Each grievance, once removed from its pedestal and an interpretive framework, became simply what it had always been. One moment among many, part of a larger story that included both suffering and joy, betrayal and kindness, loss and discovery. When the museum vanished with the sunrise, Robert found himself in his actual spare bedroom, surrounded by the debris of his former curation. Journals filled with resentments, boxes of correspondence preserved to document slights, photographs arranged to emphasize moments of disappointment while hiding moments of connection. For the first time in years, he felt the possibility of experiencing life directly rather than filtering it through his archive of suffering. The feeling was unfamiliar and slightly terrifying, like emerging from a dark room into bright sunlight. This is what Jung identified as the negative anima complex, the unconscious way we become attached to our own suffering, turning pain into identity and grievance into purpose. Jung observed that some individuals develop such a sophisticated relationship with their wounds that healing becomes a threat to their sense of self. In modern life, this manifests as the person who can never enjoy success because it would invalidate their narrative of being underappreciated, the individual who sabotages relationships to maintain their story about being unlovable, the victim who refuses recovery because it would require abandoning their familiar role. In contemporary culture, we see this in social media algorithms that reward emotional pain with attention, in therapy cultures that can become addicted to processing trauma, in political movements that define themselves entirely through opposition and grievance. Schopenhauer would recognize this as one of the will's most perverse tricks. It convinces us that our suffering makes us special, that our pain gives us meaning, that our grievances justify our existence. The will creates attachment not just to pleasure, but to familiar forms of pain, ensuring that we remain entrapped in patterns of suffering even when escape becomes possible. The ancients called it the curse of Tantalus, to be forever reaching for satisfaction while simultaneously ensuring it remains just out of reach. Today, psychology names it trauma bonding with one's own victim identity. What museum have you built from your suffering? Which moments have you chosen to illuminate, and which have you hidden in shadow? What would happen if you stopped curating your pain and started experiencing your actual life? The most sophisticated prisons are those we build from our own experiences, carefully selecting only the evidence that proves we deserve to remain locked inside. The key to freedom is not forgetting the past, but remembering all of it, the wounds and the healing, the betrayals and the kindnesses, the endings and the beginnings. In the deepest cave of himself, Michael discovers that the voice he's been obeying was never his father's. It was always his own. The summons came, as they always did, through dreams that felt more real than waking life. Michael found himself standing at the entrance to a cave that seemed to exist in the space between memory and imagination, its mouth carved into the side of a mountain that was both familiar and impossible. This was where he came to receive his instructions, where the voice that had guided his life for 35 years would tell him once again who he was supposed to be. The cave was vast and ancient, its walls lined with phosphorescent minerals that cast just enough light to navigate by, but never enough to see clearly. Deep within, past chambers filled with the bones of abandoned dreams and corridors, lined with discarded possibilities, was the sanctum where the voice resided. Michael had been making this journey since childhood, whenever he needed to know what to do, what to think, what to want. The voice was everything his father had never been: certain, commanding, impossible to disappoint. It spoke with the authority of absolute knowledge about who Michael should become, what career would earn respect, which woman was worthy of marriage, how success should be measured and failure avoided. The voice had guided him through law school when he wanted to study music, through a marriage that looked perfect from the outside, through a career that provided everything except satisfaction. "You're here," the voice said as Michael approached the familiar altar where he had received guidance for decades. "Good, there are new instructions." But tonight, something was different. As the voice began to speak, Michael found himself listening, not just to the words, but to the sound itself. The timbre, the rhythm, the particular way certain phrases were emphasized. With growing unease, he realized that the voice sounded familiar in a way he had never allowed himself to acknowledge. "The promotion at Hendricks and Associates," the voice continued. "You must accept it, regardless of the travel requirements. Sarah's concerns about your absence are irrelevant. Success requires sacrifice." Michael had heard these exact words before, not here in the cave, but in his own thoughts during the argument with his wife 2 nights ago. The phrasing was identical, the dismissive tone towards Sarah's feelings perfectly matched. But how could the voice be echoing his own thoughts when the voice was supposed to be guiding him toward thoughts he wouldn't have had otherwise? "Wait," Michael said, his voice sounding strange in the phosphorescent darkness. "Repeat that last part." "Success requires sacrifice," the voice intoned with familiar authority. Michael stepped closer to the source of the sound. In all his years of pilgrimage to this cave, he had never approached the altar directly, had never questioned the origin of the guidance he received. The voice simply was, as inevitable as gravity, as unquestionable as breath. But now, with growing horror and fascination, he moved toward the shadows where the voice originated. What he found there defied every assumption he had built his life upon. There was no ancient oracle, no wise father figure, no external source of wisdom at all. Instead, there was a mirror, but not a mirror that showed his current appearance. This mirror reflected him as he had been at age 7, sitting in his father's study, watching a man who never looked up from his papers, never offered guidance, never provided the strong masculine voice that Michael had spent his entire life desperately seeking. The child in the mirror was speaking, but the words coming out were in the voice that had guided Michael's adult life. "You must work harder to deserve attention," the 7-year-old was saying in tones of absolute authority. "Emotions are weaknesses that successful men don't indulge. Choose the practical path, always the practical path. Other people's feelings are obstacles to achievement." Michael stared in growing horror as he realized what he was witnessing. The voice that had seemed so wise, so masculine, so authoritative, was actually his 7-year-old self's desperate attempt to create the father he had never had. In the absence of genuine paternal guidance, his child mind had constructed an internal authority figure based on fragments of what he imagined strong men should sound like, pieced together from movies, books, and glimpses of other people's fathers. But the most devastating realization was yet to come. As he watched his child self in the mirror, Michael saw that the guidance he had been receiving all these years wasn't wisdom at all. It was a terrified child's guess about how to avoid abandonment. Every decision the voice had directed him to make had been motivated not by genuine strength, but by the desperate fear that if he showed vulnerability, authenticity, or need, he would be rejected as completely as his father had rejected him. The voice had never been his father's voice because his father had never spoken to him with authority or care. The voice was his own creation, built from his deepest wounds and his most desperate fears, masquerading as the masculine wisdom he had never received. As Schopenhauer understood, what we call desire for paternal approval is often the will's way of keeping us trapped in childhood, forever seeking permission from ghosts to live our own lives. The mirror began to crack, and as it did, Michael heard other voices for the first time, voices he had been ignoring for decades, while listening only to his own internal echo. There was Sarah's voice, not as an obstacle to success, but as a woman who loved him and wanted him to be present in their marriage. There was his own adult voice, buried under years of performance, expressing interests and dreams that the voice had dismissed as impractical. There were the voices of friends who had tried to connect with him before giving up on the man who seemed to be following a script no one else could read. The cave began to collapse, not violently, but with the gentle inevitability of a structure that had only ever been held together by belief. As the walls fell away, Michael found himself in the familiar sanctum of received wisdom, but standing in his own living room at 3 a.m, having fallen asleep in his father's old chair while working on another weekend project designed to prove his worth to a man who had been dead for 5 years. The instructions he had been following, the voice he had been obeying, the wisdom he had been seeking, all of it had been his own desperate creation, a ventriloquist act performed by a wounded child who had never learned that masculinity could include uncertainty, vulnerability, the courage to live without a script. For the first time in 35 years, Michael sat in silence without seeking guidance from anyone, including himself. In that silence, he began to hear something revolutionary. The possibility that he might not need permission from any voice, real or imagined, to live his own life. This is what Jung called the father complex, the unconscious way we create internal authorities to fill the void left by inadequate or absent parental guidance. Jung recognized that these internal figures often become more tyrannical than any real parent could be, because they are built from our childhood fears rather than adult wisdom. In contemporary life, this manifests as the man who cannot make decisions without imagining what some idealized father figure would approve of, the individual who rebels against authorities that exist only in his own mind, the person who spends their entire life seeking approval from internal voices that can never be satisfied because they were created from wounds rather than love. We see this in workaholics who drive themselves toward achievements that no real person is demanding, in men who sacrifice their relationships to impress fathers who are either dead or emotionally unavailable, in the epidemic of men who cannot access their own authentic desires because they are too busy trying to fulfill expectations that exist only in their own traumatized imagination. Schopenhauer would see this as the will's ultimate deception. It convinces us that our suffering comes from not living up to external standards, when in fact our suffering comes from the standards we unconsciously created to avoid facing our original abandonment. The will creates the internal authority figure, then ensures that we remain forever children in relationship to our own projections. The ancients called it being haunted by the fathers. Today, psychology names it the internalized critical parent, the voice that claims to guide us, but actually imprecises us within our childhood wounds. What voice have you been obeying that sounds like wisdom but feels like prison? Whose approval are you seeking? And does that person actually exist outside your own wounded imagination? The cruelest fathers are often the ones we create for ourselves, built from our deepest fears about what we must become to deserve love. The freedom to be an adult begins with the recognition that we have been taking orders from our own terrified inner child, and that child has been guessing about strength for so long that it has forgotten what authentic power actually feels like.